On May 29th, 1453, at exactly 5:30 inches the morning, the walls of Constantinople, walls that had stood for over 1,000 years, walls that had repelled 23 sieges, walls that were considered the most impregnable fortifications in human history, finally broke. Ottoman cannons had been firing for 53 days straight. The largest cannon ever built, a monster called the Basilica, had finally shattered a section near the street Romanus Gate, and through that breach poured 80,000 Ottoman soldiers, screaming Allah Akbar as they flooded into the streets of the greatest city in Christendom. But what happened next? What Ottoman soldiers did to the Byzantine noble families trapped inside the city wasn't just conquest. It was systematic humiliation, cultural annihilation, the deliberate destruction of an entire civilization, carried out person by person, family by family, over 3 days of horrors that shocked even hardened Ottoman commanders. Show dramatic image of Constantinople burning, Byzantine nobles fleeing. The fall of Constantinople didn't just end an empire. It ended bloodlines that stretched back to ancient Rome. It erased families who had ruled for centuries. And the way it happened, the specific brutality inflicted on Byzantine nobility, was far worse than any history textbook will ever tell you. This is what really happened to Byzantine noble families when Constantinople fell. To understand the full horror of what we're about to discuss, you need to understand who the Byzantine nobility were and why their destruction was so systematic. Constantinople in 1453 wasn't just any city. It was the last remnant of the Roman Empire, the direct continuation of Imperial Rome itself. The Byzantine emperors claimed unbroken succession from Caesar Augustus. The noble families of Constantinople traced their lineages back hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. These weren't just wealthy aristocrats. They were the keepers of classical knowledge, the preservers of ancient Greek and Roman texts, the patrons of philosophy and art. When we talk about Byzantine noble families, we're talking about the Palaiologos, Imperial family, the Kantakouzenos clan, the Notaras dynasty, the Komnenos descendants families, whose names appeared in documents dating back to the 4th century. These families lived in massive palace complexes inside Constantinople. They owned estates throughout the Byzantine territories. They commanded private armies. They held titles like Caesar, Despot, Sebastocrator, ranks of nobility that Rome itself had created. And they genuinely believed, until the very last moment, that their city was divinely protected. Constantinople had the Virgin Mary's cloak. It had pieces of the true cross. It had withstood 23 sieges over 1,100 years. Surely God wouldn't let it fall. But on the 29th of May 1453, God didn't intervene. Sultan Mehmed II, known as Mehmed the Conqueror, had spent years preparing for this moment. He was 21 years old, brilliant, ruthless, and obsessed with taking Constantinople. He had brought 80,000 soldiers, the most advanced cannons ever built, and a navy of 126 ships to blockade the city. Inside Constantinople, Emperor Constantine XI, Palaiologos, had only 7,000 defenders and a population of about 50,000 civilians, down from the city's peak population of 500,000 inches, its glory days. The Byzantine Empire was a dying empire, and everyone knew it. But the noble families refused to evacuate. They refused to flee, because running would mean admitting that their 1,000-year-old empire was truly over. So they stayed. And when the walls broke on that Tuesday morning in May, they were trapped inside a city that was about to become hell on earth. The 3 days of chaos. Minutes 4 to 9. Narrator. Ottoman siege warfare followed specific rules. When a city surrendered, its people were spared. But when a city resisted, especially after being given multiple chances to surrender, Ottoman law permitted 3 days of unrestricted plunder. Constantinople had refused to surrender. Mehmed had offered terms. Emperor Constantine had rejected them. So when Ottoman soldiers finally broke through, they were legally entitled to 3 days of chaos. 3 days where the city and everything in it, property, wealth, and people, belonged to whoever could take it. What happened next was documented by multiple sources: Ottoman historians, Italian merchants who survived, Greek priests who witnessed it, and even some of the Ottoman soldiers themselves who later expressed regret. Hour 1. The breach. The first Ottoman soldiers through the walls were janissaries and bashi bazouks, irregular troops promised unlimited plunder. They poured through multiple breaches, screaming, brandishing swords and axes. Byzantine noble families were caught completely off guard. Despite hearing the walls break, many still believed their soldiers would hold. When Ottoman troops appeared in their neighborhoods, in their streets, kicking down the doors of their palaces, it was already too late to flee. According to Venetian surgeon Niccolò Barbaro, who was trapped in the city, the first thing Ottoman soldiers did was hunt for the wealthiest homes. They could identify them by their size, their elaborate facades, their guards. Byzantine nobles who tried to fight were killed immediately. Those who surrendered were restrained, hands bound, forced to the ground. Hour 2. The systematic looting. Ottoman soldiers moved methodically through noble palaces. They knew what they were looking for: gold, jewels, religious relics, silk, artwork, and most importantly, people who could be ransomed or sold. The palace of Lucas Notaras, the Megas Du, Grand Duke of the Byzantine Navy, was one of the first targeted. Notaras was the wealthiest man in Constantinople, after the emperor himself. His palace complex housed over 200 people, family members, servants, guards, slaves. According to Ottoman chronicler Tursun Beg, soldiers broke into the Notaras palace and found the family gathered in the main hall, praying before an icon of the Virgin Mary. The soldiers didn't care. They tore the icon from the wall, stripped it of its golden frame, and then turned to the family. Lucas, Notaras, his wife, his teenage daughters, his young sons all were separated, bound, and marked for different fates. Hour 3 to day 3. The sorting. This is where the true systematic horror began. Ottoman soldiers didn't just kill or randomly abuse the nobility. They sorted them by value. Category 1. Males of fighting age, 14 to 50. Byzantine noblemen were either killed on sight or enslaved for galley service. There was no middle ground. If you were a nobleman who had resisted, you died. If you surrendered, you became a slave. Category 2. Children boys, under 14. Young boys from noble families were valuable. Many were taken for the Dev-Shurma system we discussed in video 2, the child levy, that turned Christian boys into janissaries. Noble boys were especially prized because they were educated and could read. Category 3. Elderly and religious figures. Old men and priests were generally killed. They had no labor value and couldn't be converted or trained. Orthodox priests in noble households were often executed publicly as symbolic victories over Christianity. Category 4. Women and girls. This is where the most calculated cruelty occurred. Byzantine noblewomen and their daughters became the most valuable plunder of all, both economically and symbolically. Byzantine noblewomen were the ultimate prizes of the conquest, and what happened to them was designed not just to inflict suffering, but to humiliate an entire civilization. These weren't peasant women. These were women who had lived their entire lives in luxury, educated in Greek, Latin, and theology, trained in courtly etiquette, dressed in silk and jewels, never doing manual labor, never seen in public without veils, never touched by any man except their husbands. In Byzantine culture, a noblewoman's honor was sacred. Her chastity before marriage, her fidelity after, her modesty, her seclusion from public view, all of this defined not just her worth, but her family's status. The Ottomans knew this, and they specifically targeted this. According to Michael Doukas, a Byzantine historian who fled Constantinople and later interviewed survivors, what happened to noblewomen followed a specific pattern. Stage 1. Public display. Within hours of capture, Byzantine noblewomen were stripped of their elaborate court dresses. Soldiers tore off their jewelry, necklaces, rings, earrings, often ripping earlobes in the process. They removed their headdresses and veils, which was itself considered a profound violation in Byzantine culture. The women were then paraded through the streets, not hidden, not covered, paraded openly, so that any surviving Byzantine citizens could see them. The message was clear. Your empress, your princesses, your noble ladies, look at them now. The wife of Lucas Notaras, whose name was Anna, was forced to walk barefoot through the streets wearing only an undergarment. She was 47 years old and had never appeared in public without full court dress in her entire adult life. Stage 2. The auction. Constantinople had multiple slave markets, but after the conquest, temporary markets were set up throughout the city. Ottoman soldiers brought their captives, Byzantine nobles, their wives, their daughters, and sold them to the highest bidders. Italian merchant Giacomo de Langucci, who witnessed this, wrote, Noble ladies who had never touched coins in their lives were now being sold like cattle. Mothers were separated from daughters, sisters were torn from each other, and they were being bought by men who would have been considered beneath acknowledgement in Byzantine society: common soldiers, merchants, even servants. The prices varied by age and beauty. Young noble women in their teens and 20s sold for the highest amounts. According to Ottoman records, a 6-year-old Byzantine noblewoman could fetch 100 gold ducats, roughly equivalent to $50,000 in today's money. But older noblewomen, while less valuable, suffered a different humiliation. They were sold in bulk, sometimes 10 or 15 together, to be used as domestic servants. Women who had commanded households of 50 servants were now servants themselves. Stage 3. The concubine selection. Senior Ottoman commanders had first choice of captives before the general auction. They specifically sought out the most beautiful and highest-ranking Byzantine women for their harems. Sultan Mehmed II himself took multiple Byzantine noblewomen as concubines. The daughter of Lucas Notaras, a girl named Maria, age 14, was brought before Mehmed. He offered Notaras a choice. Give me your daughter willingly, and I'll spare your family. Refuse, and everyone dies. According to the chronicle of George Sphrantzes, who was a friend of the Notaras family, Lucas refused. He said, "It is better for my daughter to die a Christian virgin than live in shame as a Muslim concubine." Mehmed had Lucas beheaded. Then he took Maria anyway. Stage 4. Forced conversion and integration. The noble women who became concubines or wives of Ottoman officials faced systematic cultural erasure, similar to what the Janissary boys experienced. They were given Turkish names. They were forced to convert to Islam not through convincing theological argument, but through simple declaration. Refuse, and you'd be beaten, starved, or given to soldiers. They were taught Turkish. They were forbidden from speaking Greek. They were dressed in Ottoman fashion. They were taught Islamic prayers and customs. And most devastatingly, they were told their families were dead, whether true or not. This severed any remaining psychological ties to their Byzantine identity. Within months, a Byzantine noblewoman who had lived in a palace, attended by servants, educated in classical philosophy, participating in elaborate court ceremonies, would be unrecognizable. She'd be speaking Turkish, wearing a hijab, praying to Allah, and serving an Ottoman master who saw her as property. But the cruelest fate was reserved for the Byzantine Imperial family itself. Emperor Constantine XI, Palaiologos, died fighting on the walls. His body was never formally identified, though some Ottoman soldiers claimed they'd killed him and paraded a head they said was his through the streets. But Constantine had family members trapped in the city, his nephews, his cousins, members of the Palaiologos dynasty, who could theoretically claim the Byzantine throne if they survived. Mehmed couldn't allow that, so he systematically hunted down every Palaiologos he could find. One of the most tragic cases was that of young Thomas Palaiologos, the emperor's nephew, who was 11 years old. He was found hiding in the monastery of Chora, a famous church covered in golden mosaics. Ottoman soldiers dragged him out, while monks begged for his life. Mehmed gave the boy a choice: convert to Islam and serve in the Ottoman court, or die. The boy chose death. He was 11 years old. He was beheaded in front of the monastery. The women of the imperial family faced a different fate. Any female relative of Emperor Constantine, his nieces, cousins, distant relatives who was of childbearing age, was taken for Mehmed's harem or given to his top commanders. This wasn't just about lust. This was about bloodline eradication. If these women bore children, those children would be raised as Muslims, as Turks, as Ottomans. The Palaiologos bloodline would be mixed, diluted, and ultimately erased. And it worked. Today, genetic studies show that many modern Turkish families, especially in Istanbul, carry Byzantine Greek DNA remnants of the noble families who were forcibly integrated into Ottoman society. The bloodlines that trace back to Roman emperors didn't end. They were absorbed and erased, genetically present, but culturally extinct. The 3 days of plunder ended on the 1st of June, 1453. Mehmed II officially declared the looting over and began restoring order to his new capital city. But by then, the damage was done. Estimates suggest that out of 50,000 people in Constantinople, when it fell, approximately 30,000 were enslaved. Of those, Byzantine nobles and their families made up about 5,000 to 8,000 people. Entire family lineages were erased in 3 days. Dynasties that had existed for centuries vanished. Libraries collected over generations were burned or looted. Palaces were stripped to the walls. Some noble families did escape. A few managed to bribe Ottoman soldiers and flee to Genoese or Venetian ships. Some made it to the Peloponnese, to Italy, to the Balkans, but most didn't. And for those who survived as slaves or concubines, they lived the rest of their lives knowing they were the last of their line, the last to remember what their family had been, the last to speak their grandfather's name, the last to know the stories. When they died, that knowledge died with them. The fall of Constantinople wasn't just a military conquest, it was cultural genocide. It was the deliberate destruction of an entire civilization's elite class, carried out person by person, family by family. And the method was specific. Kill the men, take the children, absorb the women, erase the memory. So, what happened to Byzantine noble families after Constantinople fell? They were killed, enslaved, sold, forcibly converted, sexually exploited, and culturally erased. Their children were taken, their bloodlines were absorbed, their identities were destroyed. Some became Ottoman concubines. Some became domestic slaves. Some died, refusing to convert. A few escaped and spent the rest of their lives in exile, telling anyone who would listen about the empire that once was. But all of them, every single one, lost everything in 3 days. Their wealth, their status, their freedom, their culture, their very identities. This wasn't the chaos of war. This was systematic. This was calculated. This was the Ottoman Empire demonstrating that when you resisted, when you refused to surrender, when you fought to the bitter end, this is what happened. Your entire civilization would be erased. The fall of Constantinople ended the Byzantine Empire. But what Ottoman soldiers did to Byzantine noble families, that ended something deeper. It ended the last living connection to ancient Rome. It ended bloodlines stretching back 1,000 years. It ended a culture that had preserved classical knowledge through the Dark Ages. And it did it in the most personal, most cruel, most humiliating way possible. That is what happened to Byzantine noble families after Constantinople fell, and it was worse than you could have ever imagined.